during many years the situation. But I really wanted to just start telling you that the first time I came to Gaza was in 2001. And at that time, in the press, Gaza was described as the biggest jail on earth.
Okay, I can stop you there. I realized I forgot to press a button, so we weren't actually live, but now we are really live. I'm sorry for this.
Okay, so that means I have to go back and backtrack.
You go back. So everybody, you missed very nice things that Kent was saying.
Well, anyway, I don't know. Well, I will try to remember what I said, but I think I will go back to the question between news and art and photography and long projects. But I think at this time, the most important now is what's going on in Gaza. It's the fourth attack since 2007, but I want to backtrack to 2001 when I arrived the first time in Gaza, trying to understand what's going on. I mean, first thing, you know, I'm from Sweden. I don't speak Arabic. So from the beginning, I was trying to meet with people and I was trying to cooperate with people. And I think a lot of my first trips were, you know, usually spent a lot of time on the streets, demonstrations, funerals, etc. But I met some people from Palestinian Center for Human Rights in Khan Yunis. I became friends with them. And I think the most important story and where I really started to see the situation of the Palestinians in Gaza was when I did a story about Bahar Street. Bahar Street means the street to the sea. And in Khan Yunis, it goes from the center, passing the stores, going by the football, where you play football, the hospital on the left side, you get up to the market, and then you walk through and you reach actually the refugee, the camp. And after that, there is an area where all the houses were destroyed. And on the other side of the destroyed houses, the ruins of houses, there was an Israeli settlement. And I would see people standing on top of the road. It was like on the hill overlooking the sea. But basically, the people could not go down to the sea there. They had to track back. They had to go through other Israeli posts at that time. This is when there still was the Israeli settlement. And I felt such an injustice. It was very difficult for me to understand how one people could decide about another people's fate and their, you know, actions and possibilities in such a way. And then after that, I kind of backtracked and I was criticized by a Palestinian in Sweden who said, when he saw my images, do you think this is life in Gaza? Because it was a lot of demonstrations and funerals, etc. And it made me think and reflect on my role as a European coming to Gaza, and what was really lacking in the stories that you usually tell in the press. And instead, I was talking more and more to my friends in Gaza. And through them, I found these stories which talk more about everyday life, because I think it's a lack in the presentation of what's going on in Gaza. It's like you say, there's always press, there are always photographers where there is a conflict, but I'm really actually interested in the time between the conflicts. So this is the base for my work. And then a little bit about the airport, which is the latest work. It's really about, you know, like everyone's dream in Gaza to be able to travel freely, to travel, to study, to work where it's possible. And now I think I should give Mohammed, I think you should come in and let's go back to, you know, where we are right now in Gaza.
Thank you so much, Kent. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. One quick thing before I start is to the audience, in case they missed this, that they could write us any questions in the comment section. And thanks to Mary Angela and Jonathan for their kind hospitality and Havremagasinet for this event. I think the best way to start is to discuss what's happening right now. Why is it happening? How did we get here? What is the way out and what can be done to it? So in that way, we start on a grim note and end with a positive, more practical, forward-looking one. And the only thing that comes to my mind to describe what's happening right now in Gaza is that I stopped telling my family the words, stay safe, it's gonna be okay. Because every time I say it, the repetition of it is enormously guilting. It brings enormous pain because there is nothing they can do to be safe. Gaza does not have any bomb shelters, doesn't have an iron dome, no escape routes, no safe areas, and no ability to escape, to leave the entire area, as borders, as Kent discussed already, are entirely closed. And at the same time, whatever I say that things are going to get better or there's more hope soon does not carry any weight to it when on the same night they see Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Benny Gantz making statements on TV like, Gaza will burn, literally. Another statement, towers will continue to crumble, presidential towers. The majority of Gazans are living in such towers or buildings, high-rise buildings, because it's one of the most densely populated areas in the world. So between 1 second and another, my family, loved ones, friends, everyone I knew can either be the ones under the rubble, the lucky ones who have just made an escape but not so lucky for becoming permanently homeless, or the ones maybe more fortunate to watch from a short distance and get a trauma out of this for a long time. The way my family is describing this, and friends and loved ones, the first thing, the most intuitive thought is as grim and hard to swallow and say, we're gonna die. That's the intuitive, the increasingly most common thing that people are saying. The second thing is, this is pure madness. There's been nothing like this before on Gaza. I lived through 3 wars in Gaza within the years 2008, 2012, and 2014. But the sheer scale and intensity of this operation, of this assault, is unprecedented. So one cousin that lives in the north of Gaza, on Thursday night, he said that there were airstrikes seemingly everywhere. In the dead of the night, the skies were lit ablaze momentarily. He froze in his place. He couldn't look out the window. He couldn't make a run out for his life because it seemed coming from everywhere. He just squeezed his eye shut and stayed in place. On that night, Israel announced it bombed Gaza with 450 bombs from 160 warplanes within 30 minutes. In half an hour, 450 bombs. So the scale and intensity is like nothing that's been seen before. Another word that people in Gaza are using is unrecognizable. So the area where my family lives is one of the most fortunate. It's one of the least devastated. And yet my sister is saying that our street is now unrecognizable. Many of Gaza's iconic sites are likewise totally unrecognizable. Entire towers have been brought to the ground. And Israel is not only hiding its intention behind this. The prime minister or politicians in this equation are more or less trying to make a statement. And I can say that everyone I know in Gaza has already packed a small bag by the front door with their lightweight but most treasured belongings in case they need to make a run for their lives. That's how it is as of now. As of why we got to this moment, I think these events are becoming, and this might be recognized by the audience, that this is becoming part of a repetitive cycle that's all too familiar to everyone, most familiar to people in Gaza. Every once in a while you hear about airstrikes. It comes down within few months or a year and more airstrikes and goes on. This cycle, it always begins with a demand on Palestinians to be moderate and keep quiet. But as soon as we do, we literally disappear, along with the urgency in the international community to do anything about what's happening. The media attention on Gaza vanishes as if the entire enclave evaporated overnight. What people are left with is an uninhabitable cage, a toxic slum where people are caged from birth to death. Then that sort of calm that Israel fails to build on or reward or incentivize or move forward from. Instead, the current far-right government under Netanyahu uses this camp to push the limits of Palestinians, provoke, squeeze, and that emboldens far-right settlers across the West Bank and East Jerusalem to also take their turn and provoke and brutalize Palestinians. So the scenes in East Jerusalem that are familiar to many people in Sheikh Jarrah over the month of Ramadan, where police, settlers, and state are brutalizing and provoking Palestinians day and night, made it unbearable for people in Gaza to stay idle. It also lent credence to advocates of violence. Violence is not the main platform for Palestinians. What most Palestinians want, the overwhelming majority, is to have a normal life with a job, being able to start a life and start a family. But in moments of despair, rage, and weakness, violence gains momentum and relevance increasingly from fringe elements of society as two things: deterrence as a hopeless call and desperate call for deterrence to stop the madness that's happening, and as counter-intimidation. If they make our life into hell, then so should theirs. That does not justify or legitimize it, but that's how we got here. The other important thing that got us here is that people in Gaza feel like they have nothing to lose, nothing to hope for, and that it's not going to get any better. When it gets worse across the West Bank or Jerusalem, it sends a message to Gazans that if you keep quiet or not, it's going to be the same. And the equation that is most intimate to Palestinians is that yesterday is remembered with fondness, whether that means last night, last week, last year. Today is marked as the absolute worst. It couldn't get worse than that. And yet people have an absolute certainty that tomorrow is going to be even worse. And this sort of despair, in these moments of extraordinary, unbelievable despair, that also fringe elements of society that advocate violence would gain momentum. The dangers of this going on, especially when not so long ago, 2 years ago, Gazans organized the protest of the March of Return, overwhelmingly nonviolent movement that was not only did it fail to get the attention of the international community sufficiently, but it was brutalized by Israel in broad daylight with no consequences. One of the things that make Gazans feel they have nothing to lose and nothing to hope for is the central theme of today in Kent's exhibition, is the issue of access. The airport, it occupies a central space in Palestinian lives that I cannot overemphasize. I have my father's ticket from the Palestinian Airlines from the year 1999. Every time I hold it, it's one of my most treasured belongings. Every time I hold this, it fills me with enormous reverence and awe that one day we had an airport and that this can happen again. Access in Gaza is synonymous to humiliation. If you have watched Farah Nabulsi's movie on Netflix, The Present, you would be all too familiar with this. Humiliation and indignities in pursuit of having the most basic right to freedom of movement to get in and out of the enclave. The other thing is prevention of having a normal life or an economy or any sort of thing going on. So even for medical patients in need of treatment abroad, students, families that are separated, it's an excruciating process to petition for an extraordinary exceptional security permit from Israel to exercise temporarily the freedom of movement, get for a few hours and back. And that is denied for the majority of the population. And at the same time, for people in Gaza, there is no ability to move to the West Bank. Israel regards our presence in the West Bank as aliens. If someone from Gaza marries someone from the West Bank, the West Bank Palestinian is relegated to the lower status. He can be regarded as Gazan as well. They lose the status of being in any West Bank Palestinian city. So this demographic movement towards the cage makes the whole issue of access one of the most central elements in Gaza. And I will go back to Kent now before I return to discussing some ways forward.
But I think that...
Can I interject? Kommer jag upp då? I think we had some technical difficulties. We had some technical difficulties in the beginning, and we lost our introductions. Thank you, Muhammad, and thank you, Kent Klich. Kent Klich is the photographer who has worked for 20 years in Gaza, and who we are proud to have at display here at Havremagasinet right now, his exhibition, Gaza International Airport. And Muhammad Shehada, Palestinian writer from Gaza, currently living in Lund, but you have a lot of relatives still living in Gaza and experiencing these horrible events firsthand. So I would ask you first, and before we go to Kent, Muhammad, if you could recite or tell us about these recent events, in particular the chain of events, and describe the situation.
Well, the current situation is part of a cycle that repeats itself every once in a while. It starts with a demand on Palestinians to be quiet. As soon as they disappear. Israel fails to reward this quiet. Instead, it abuses it, takes it for granted, and pushes the limits of Palestinians and advances the settlement expansion across the West Bank, restrictions in Gaza, and evictions in East Jerusalem. Then settlers in Israel, far-right settlers, they feel emboldened by that sort of equation to also take the return and attack Palestinians. When rage accumulates, along with despair and hopelessness, and an environment in Gaza where people have nothing to lose and nothing to hope for, it lends credence to advocates of violent armed resistance as deterrence to end this ongoing nightmare, or as a vengeful call for counter-intimidation. If we suffer, so should they. Why should we suffer alone? That is not to legitimize or justify it, but that's how it ends up happening. As soon as actors of armed resistance in Gaza, or violent actors in Gaza, act, that's where Gaza surfaces back in the media for decision makers, for politicians, for everyone in the international community, not before and not after. And that's one of the tragic things, is that this positions the conflict as something that's hopeless, something that's permanent, and something that's going to go on forever. But it's not, and it's not meant to be. The way it's happening in Gaza now, to put it in very brief sentences, is that it's unprecedented in terms of the intensity and scale. Gazans have never seen anything like this. I've never seen anything like this, although I lived through 3 wars within 6 years. The amount of rockets Israel is bombarding Gaza with is like nothing one could imagine. In some instances, it's 60 airstrikes per minute. In 1/2 an hour, it was 450 bombs. So a relative of mine that lives in the north of Gaza told me that he was afraid to make a run for his life on Thursday night when Israel dropped those 450 bombs. It seemed like it's coming from everywhere. There's nowhere to go. So he just closed his eyes shut and froze in place. And the thing about this escalation is that it's rendering large parts of Gaza as unrecognizable. All throughout the city, the damage is on unprecedented scale. Residential towers, main roads to hospitals, iconic sites and areas in Gaza like El Jundi El Majhul that Kent would know, where people from all across the Gaza Strip frequent for relaxation, is now unrecognizable as well. And the danger of this is that, number one, the longer this escalation goes on, nobody's going to benefit, especially civilians. Number one is that it creates bitterness and hatred more and more on both sides of the fence. And the other thing is that this is the 4th war that Israel conducts in Gaza within the last decade. This time there's less and less interest from international donors to go and fix what Israel will destroy in a couple of years. So that means whatever is going to be destroyed now is going to remain destroyed for so many years to come.
Mohammed, I just want to comment on a small thing, because I think that people who have not been to Gaza, you mentioned that it's very densely populated. And of course, because both you and I, we have been there. So I think maybe for the people who are listening and watching this, I think it's a good idea to try to say, the size of Gaza is like 42 kilometers. So wherever you live, you think like 42 kilometers, far away from where your house is. And there is a corridor, which is, I think, between 6 and 12 kilometers wide. And in this area, this very, very small area, I think you should think that there are around 2 million people living. So I think it's important to understand that when Gaza is bombed, there is nowhere to escape. And I think you explained it very well, but I think it's really important to add this thing that, the distance, the area is 42 square meters and then 6 to 12 kilometers wide. And it's so dense with people. So there is no escape. Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about, this is a question to you, Kent, because now these events are in the news. But we have also talked about how this is ongoing. The evictions are ongoing. The oppression is ongoing, and you have spoken about how your work kind of springs from a media criticism. Could you explain that?
Well, I work for newspapers and I work for magazines, so I know very well how it works, and I also know how there is a kind of a sense of economy in the newspapers and magazines, that they want things when there is a conflict, when something is happening. And I know from journalists and photographers in Gaza that it's actually very difficult to tell stories about everyday life in Gaza, because basically no one is really interested. There is a change which happened, I think, and Mohammed, you correct me if I'm saying something which is not right, but in 2000, the conflict in 2008-9, Israel was actually blocking a lot of international press coming to Gaza during the conflict. There were a few international journalists working there. And I remember I tried to get in during the conflict, but I could not. So I think that it gave the possibility for Palestinian journalists and photographers to tell stories about Gaza. And I think that's good. And I think that's happening much more often now with Facebook, social media, et cetera, that we hear voices directly from Gaza that we didn't do before. So in that sense, I think Gaza was more closed in one sense than it is now. There's still a problem, and that is that the foreign or the media usually are interested in the conflict. So there is still kind of this lack of everyday stories from the perspective of people. And I think that with my work, because I also work with news and I work for the Red Cross and other organizations, I had, been fortunate enough to be able to decide to stay longer periods of time and trying through my journalistic work to find these other stories which are more personal, which are more from the point of view of people's dreams or coping with resistance or protests or whatever it is. But it's nothing, you can't just go in and out, and especially as a foreigner, it's really difficult to understand a different society. So you need to work with people, you need to get to know people. And, basically all my work has been impossible without, the discussions, the help, the support that I've had from the people I know living in Gaza. And I think that the airport is an example of, I think when it was 2017, it was the 10 year of the siege. And I was discussing with people, it's still going on. People cannot travel. So I wanted to tell something about a dream, that people had. And I met people who'd been working at the airport, engineers. I worked people from Palestinian Airlines. I went to their office in Gaza. And I was very moved just by, this was the big dream. This was the hope that everyone could see and travel away directly from Gaza, not to go to another international airport, not to go to Israel, not to go to Jordania, but to be able to fly from Palestine. And I even have these drawings of how the plans were for developing the flights, which started going to, Jordania, going to Egypt, etc., etc. And then there was another map going to Rome and to France, etc. So the work that I am doing on the airport is actually, it's actually try to be able to listen and to hear people's dreams about, another kind of future and another possibility of another life in Gaza, different from it is now. And I think that Gaza has an incredible potential for a different life. It's an old trading post. It's been like, always connected to trade, and it's been a very, very good life. And I think, Mohammed, you can develop more on that, because I think there could be another future, for Gaza. There are possibilities. If it's not for the siege, if it's not for this, the constraint on the situation of the Palestinians in Gaza, then there would be a different life.
Thank you so much, Kent. I can expand on that a little bit with few thoughts on where we could go from here and what needs to be done from people. So with the first one, it's easier to start with a process of elimination, what should not be done, where we should not go. And that is a problem that's always the main focus after each one of these escalations is on restoring calm, restoring quiet, a ceasefire that has nothing following it. So to suffice with restoring calm means putting a lid on a ticking bomb, that another escalation is going to be inevitable. You're just sweeping it under the rug. And restoring the status quo, the pre-escalation status quo, is equivalent to restoring the inherently destabilizing situation that led to this escalation in the first place. So what should not be done is to restore, let's say, negative peace, the absence of violence. We should move forward to discuss the slow, latent, invisible violence where people are being impoverished, where my friends across Gaza, I think most of them, if not every one of them, have contemplated the idea of suicide at some point out of desperation, where people have reached the age of 35 without being able to get a job, without starting a life. One friend of mine who's at that age at the moment, he told me that he's so terrified of the idea of losing his life before he experienced living, before he fell in love, before he started a family. So that sort of invisible cycle of slow violence that's routinized and normalized is what caused this escalation in the first place, and we should focus very much on it if we are to prevent violence from happening to Israelis or Palestinians. The other thing that I wanted to address that Kent touched on is the issue of Gaza's untapped potentials. If the blockade is removed, it's something that everyone knows in Gaza, that it has the human capital, the infrastructure, the location to flourish. When Israel redeployed its forces, so it withdrew from Gaza, but then imposed the blockade, it claimed that Gaza can now become Singapore or Malta on the Mediterranean. But that was never fulfilled due to the denial of access of Gaza to the world. If that access is restored, again, the issue with the airport cannot be overemphasized. If it's restored, Gaza would prosper. So one thing about the airport that catches the attention of any Gazan is how many times you've been to it as a child in school. Like every year when the school would organize school trips, they would take us to the airport. It was one of the must-see areas. It's reduced to rubble, destroyed, an empty area, desolate, but it's a reminder that Gaza can flourish. And with that said, I wouldn't want to go back decades ago before this sort of blockade started or restrictions, but I can go to the most immediate timeline that I could recall extemporaneously. That is 2012, after the Arab Spring. Egypt eased restrictions on movement to Gaza. And they allowed more Gazans to go in and out freely, and foreigners as well. Because as a foreigner, you cannot go in unless you have press credentials or working in an international NGO, and that is very difficult as well. But when Egypt eased the blockade, Gaza was restoring life at an exponential rate. A lot of my friends back then that now are very desperate to escape, to leave, to immigrate to a world that is increasingly hostile to immigrants and refugees. Back then, they were saying, we will never leave. Even if you beg and cry, do you want to come with me outside? Do you want to go to Egypt? They would say, absolutely not. And that is with half a chance, with only Egypt easing restrictions in Gaza. If Israel, which is imposing a military blockade on Gaza's water space, the Mediterranean Sea, and Gaza's airspace and ground space, if it removes these restrictions, Gaza would flourish. Back in 2012, there were non-stop delegations, conferences, cultural exchanges. There were campaigns in the street for recycling plastic and paper and cleaning up the streets. Like when restrictions are in place, when access is denied, there is an immense feeling of claustrophobia that demotivates people to do anything other than wait for this to end. But when it's reduced a little bit, Gazans regain motivation and energy. There were poet and clubs all across the enclave. I can go on and on with what I saw back then. It was phenomenal. But the longer access is denied, the more these issues die out, the more the energy, the motivation, the craving for life dies out. And the more it's replaced with radicalization, with despair, with hopelessness. And that is dangerous for all parties concerned. I would conclude maybe on a few notes of what can be done on our part. And I think one of the most important things is the issue of allies and alliances. Gazans on their own cannot give the message to the world. Having someone like Kent today with me, there is language, for example, is not just about memorizing a greater amount of words. It's also about being familiar with culture, with connotations, and noticing details that I, as a Palestinian, would take for granted as common knowledge. At the same time, Kent, as a Swedish-Danish artist, can have more, let's say, more resonance if he explains Gaza to certain audiences that Palestinians would be considered as biased. So that's where alliances are crucial. The other thing is visualization. There are many things in Gaza that cannot be captured by words. One of which in 2018 at the Great Return March, there was one Gazan bare-chested holding the Palestinian flag in one arm and a rock in the other. And the Guardian published it on the front page. It won so many awards. It captured the whole spirit of the protests in something that words fail to do, that non-stop delegations or articles or any of that can do. At the same time, like recently, there is growing consensus in the human rights community to call Israel's system of discrimination against Palestinians as falling as apartheid under international law. But for my experience as a Gazan, I cannot find words that would describe the pain, the suffering, the indignation, and at the same time, the potential, the ambitions, the dreams. I cannot put it into words. And that's where visualization can fall in to deliver a narrative in few seconds that you can just see instead of trying to seek different, let's say, information or narratives or anecdotes. Another important thing that can be done is to visit the occupied territories as much as possible. If you're a journalist, if you're an artist, if you can get into Gaza, that is one of the most crucial things to do as of now. It's the most paramount thing to signal to the Gazan population that the world did not move on, that their suffering is noticed, and that we are listening to them. it's much easier to go to the West Bank. And another thing is to amplify Palestinian voices as much as possible, to bring Palestinian anecdotes, personal stories out to the public. There's a strong element about personalizing the conflict, the suffering in Gaza, that the general description, the academic definition, the political, let's say, definition or characterization of it cannot capture. You can relate, sympathize, and be touched more by a single story than the statistics of how many people in Gaza have died, 2,000 in 2014, 200 in this week, in this escalation, etc., etc. Numbers do not capture as much sympathy as personalized stories, so amplify Palestinian voices. And one more thing is to learn and educate, not just to speak up, but to ask others to speak up. And I conclude on this very small note, is that in this round of escalation, the destruction is unprecedented. But another thing that's never seen as much before is the sweeping wave of solidarity from all across the world, from celebrities, influentials, people, protesters, activists. And that is keeping people in Gaza resilient. When I talk to my family or friends, one of the first things they bring up into the discussion is, did you see John Oliver's segment on Gaza? Did you see Trevor Noah's segment on this? Did you see what Bella Hadid say? Did you see the protests in Copenhagen, in Jordan, in London, in Dublin? These things keep the population hopeful and resilient, that they are noticed, that the world did not move on, and that there's someone there trying to help.
Do you think, if I can ask a question here, that there is a real difference in the reaction and these acts of solidarity and people showing solidarity with Gaza? Is it different than it has been before? Because I don't want to sound like a cynic, but you have spoken of this, that it is a cycle, and we first need to get back to status quo. We need to end the violence, and then we have to have understanding of the people in Palestine, and we have to end the restrictions and open Gaza up. But as you have said, this hasn't happened. This has happened before, but we have never got to this point where the occupation is ended. We get back to status quo, and I think about, like, we see a lot of shows of solidarity, but also how this situation is framed in the news and how it always has been framed for my entire life. It's that Israel is the defender, that Israel is not the active part in this conflict, that they are only defending themselves. And formerly it was always like, oh, Israel is surrounded by enemies on all sides. But today, Israel has powerful allies in the whole Arab region, and Syria is basically a non-functioning state. And as you have described, like, this is unprecedented, the use of violence and use of force in Gaza. But I don't think that's the sense I get from the news. I get it from, talking to you and reading good sources, but the common sentiment is this is just business as usual, and Israel is defending themselves, and there's no change. Like, it's this frame that's always encompassed this conflict, and to me, you have to remove this frame before you can get to this point of ending restrictions and actually changing the situation and moving towards peace.
Yes, I can start with the issue of Israel's right to self-defense. And I think the issue here is that if you take the events from when Palestinian actions begin, when violence erupts from the Palestinian side, you would of course understands Israel's response as legitimate to defend its people. But if you look at the latent, the invisible conditions that don't capture the media's attention before, the severe impoverishment, the equation where 2 million people in Gaza are caged in a slum, where the water they drink is poisonous. 97% of Gaza's water is contaminated. then these give more credence to why this is happening. It explains it more. And that's something that is always a great matter of failure in the international arena, where they focus the lens from when Palestinian actions begin, not from what Palestinians are subjected to. In terms of despair and hopelessness, I totally agree. And I get that as well, the frustration with the reputation that sometimes you want to try to not look at this conflict at all, that it seems insolvable, that it seems that it doesn't have an end. At this moment, these feelings and sentiments are at a peak moment, because it seems the two-state solution is dead, the peace process is dead, there is no way out. But the Palestinian issue is now in a process of transition, where it's moving from this sort of peace process symmetry image of both sides being on equal footing to a right-based approach, that no matter if it's one state, two state, 3, 10, fried chicken, that it's a right-based approach. Those people deserve to live free and equal with security and dignity. And that is a growing consensus in the human rights community amongst politicians like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others, the progressives in the US. Another thing about public opinion, I think Kent might confirm this better than me, but in the 80s and 70s, speaking positively about Palestinians was an intimidating and frightening issue. In the US in particular, support for Israel was coming from, let's say, the liberal wing or the liberal side of politics. Nowadays, you can speak with more liberties. The supporters and enablers of Israel's occupation are in the US, for example, are the Republicans, the people on the extreme right, and autocrats across the world. So in that sense, it has moved progressively to a giant extent. With this escalation, what's unprecedented again is the amount of public opinion that's changing the narrative in the media. It's happening slowly but surely. You can see more and more mainstream media in the US, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, MSNBC, that are hosting and amplifying Palestinian voices, that are feeling less intimidated to say the word apartheid. And this is not happening out of a vacuum. It's only happening thanks to the solidarity that's exhibited in the streets and in online platforms, on social media. Without this, nothing is going to progress forward. At the same time, the protests, the solidarity online, is preventing the escalation in Gaza from getting even worse. Israel is thinking twice before they go ahead with a grand invasion. And the recommendation within Israel's defense establishment is that a grand invasion would be a point of no return in terms of PR, in terms of their image internationally. The only thing making this possible is the solidarity that we see at the moment.
Yeah. I would like for also for Kent to answer this question about how you see a way out of the situation, and if you think that these manifestations of solidarity around the world, if there's something different this time.
I feel there is a difference, as Muhammad said, when you read the news and you read the different outlets. I was surprised that the demonstrations along the border of the right to return, that actually didn't have a much more effect. But sometimes I think the actions to return, when they build up during a longer period of time, and I think now it has built up. So I think there's a stronger hope for for more questions about the right of the Palestinians. I mean, the discussion about, for example, Gaza and Israel has been very much like this. Well, Hamas, they shoot rockets as us, and we have the right to defend us. And I mean, like, if any newspaper will kind of refer to that. But I think there's another discussion coming in now, which is actually the basic, what is the right of the Palestinians? And for me, I think this is a really important step. So it's really difficult, even when you look back, to see when the change is really happening. But what I think is really strong in Gaza is, I mean, Gaza would not survive without the solidarity among people themselves. You know, of course they are helped by, you know, UNRWA, the UN, etc., etc. But there is a really strong solidarity and sense of being from Gaza and not wanting to leave. I mean, one of the people I met, which I was really, really impressed, was a man. His house was bombed in 2009, and I heard about him. They told me the story that his wife was killed, his children were killed. I think he had one surviving son. And I wanted to meet him because I heard that he built a greenhouse. And he built the greenhouse at the same time where he built where his house stood. And I spoke to him and I said, you know, I said, I'm not going to leave. I'm from Gaza. I will stay here. You know, he could have left, but he built a greenhouse, and now I know he's built a house there. So there is this very strong sense of place, of belonging, that I think, you know, people really want to stay and be there, but they also want their rights. I mean, they don't want to live confined in, you know, in a prison. And I think that the latest, and hopefully this will be, and we will see a real change. Because as Muhammad said, if everything is calm again, then it's quiet for some time, and then it starts again. But you know, there are so many young people with good educations from universities. You know, they have a saying about young people when they have a university degree. What do? They have a saying. It says driving the mattress. Driving the mattress means that you don't have a job, you cannot continue your studies, and you're just resting at home. So there's an incredible potentiality, and I hope through the last awful things which are happening in Gaza that there will be a change. And I feel that for the first time, I feel that people have been talking about apartheid before, but now it's like a mainstream to talk about apartheid. There is a relation to Black Lives Matter. There are discussions between, you know, similarities between Black Lives Matter and Palestine and etc. with South Africa during the apartheid. And I think for the Palestinians, I think that this is maybe good because it makes the Palestinians not so different. They are like other people. So this thing of trying to quiet the Palestinians or to make them invisible, I hope, and I don't think that's possible anymore. So I hope we're going into for a new set of structures and agendas.
I can add to that very briefly on two issues. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We hear you. Yeah.
So I think number one is, as Kent said, that public opinion is moving forward, and that by Palestinians, by simply staying on the land, that is the best thing that can be done at the moment, in this moment of transition where it's chaotic, where there is despair, even in the international community, even amongst European officials or American officials. What they say in private is that they see no way of the two-state solution moving on. They see nothing happening anytime soon. So it's in a moment of transition and despair. But the only thing keeping Palestinians away from giving up, from capitulation, from Israel making it worse, is the solidarity that we see on every day. So no matter how much it seems desperate and desolate, your voices are keeping Palestinians steadfast. And that brings me to the issue of art. That artists at the forefront of supporting and bolstering Palestinian resilience. If you look again, and I can mention that over and over again with Farah Nabulsi's movie, The Present, a very short one of 25 minutes, almost all of it happening in few scenes, in one main scene at a checkpoint. The indignation, the humiliation, the rage, these are things that cannot be captured by words, but can only be visualized and seen. And this one piece of art is worth more than tens of thousands of commentary, op-eds, analyses out there in the media. It pushed even the former CIA director in the US, John Brenner. If you Google and look at his face, he's the most serious you can get. Almost no facial expressions. you can simply exclude any sort of possibility for sympathy. Did called professional. And with John Brennan, he wrote an article in the New York Times that's been one of the most personal accounts I've read recently on the topic. After he saw this 25-minute movie, he came up and said, we need to end this. The suffering of Palestinians is unbearable. It should end. So with one piece of art, you can convey what years of analysis, written articles, documentation, etc. can never do. And the other thing is to personalize, to bring personal anecdotes, not just the descriptive account of destruction, despair, and desolation, but to bring stories of what people dream, what they are going through, and what they want to achieve. That is one of the best things to do in the world of media or art. And again, art is at the forefront of maintaining the steadfastness of Palestinians.
Thank you. Yeah, is it the question? We have a question here from a viewer on YouTube. And it's from one of your former students, Kent Klich, and he asks you how to overcome and make solutions about the problems of access that you have mentioned, not just in Palestine, but in the whole region, Free Palestine.
Well, I think now, Issam, I know you are from Algeria, and you told me earlier this morning that you have a passport, but it's one of the weakest passports in the world. So that means you are also confined to Algeria, and that you cannot really travel where you want. I don't have a simple solution regarding Gaza. I think it's important that one has to lift the siege. I mean, that's the only thing that will change the situation, because the people in Gaza are strong, they are smart, they are educated, and they are really good at business. It's been a place for business 500, 600, 700, 1,000 years ago. It's always been a trading post for, from the Middle East and, to Egypt and to Europe, etc., etc. So it's kind of sometimes, you have the biggest problem, and the biggest problem is the siege, because at the time when it's opening, when people can travel, when people can make business, I think Gaza will be very fine.
I can add to this very quickly, is that the issue of Gaza's suffering is entirely man-made, and it's a political decision, first and last. In Israel's own defense establishment, the Israeli Defense Ministry a couple of years ago recommended to the government to ease restrictions on Gaza because they said, quote unquote, Gaza's health system is on the verge of collapse, and that would make it difficult for the Israeli army to fight in Gaza for long and could lead to intense international intervention, end quote. So it's a man-made decision. The current government in Israel under Benjamin Netanyahu is the most right-wing and populist Israel has ever seen. The new partners in the government are the Kahanists, Osmaya Yehudit, Jewish power, are literally supremacists. Some of them were placed on the US terror list. This is extraordinary. And the only way they can take the political decision to end the suffering in Gaza is if we keep pressure on. Right now, the only thing preventing them from easing the suffering in Gaza, and that's what they are saying out publicly, not even hiding it, is not to show a sign of weakness towards the Palestinians, is to maintain a perception of being strong and maintaining Israel's deterrence capacity, the ability to keep Palestinians within line. So they know this is a moment of truth. They know Gaza is uninhabitable. They have an ample supply of recommendation from their own defense establishment to ease restrictions, but only a political decision would solve that. And it cannot come from Israel itself. It has to come from the international community. And the only way it comes from the international community is if people keep pressure on their own governments, if people continue to educate, agitate, organize, and speak up.
Do you have any questions, Mariangela?
I had a while ago, but I was thinking, Muhammad, when you mentioned the slow violence and how that contrasts that perhaps the only way of fighting back, how the news flatten the reality, a much more complex reality that needs to be told with art that opens up to those subtleties, but also how important it is to characterize the situation, to make it individual, because also speaking from own experiences from other parts of the world, how easy it is to condemn the armed violence and jump into it. Yes, this is violence, and let's say the masses can see it easily. Oh yeah, they are shooting rockets, and but it's very hard for the people to understand the slow violence what you were talking about of destroying futures, slowly destroying futures, killing the impossibility. And Kent, exactly that's what we discussed also about the importance of focusing on the Gaza airport for the exhibition. You have a much larger series of work on Gaza, of course, but for us, for me particular, it was very important to focus on the Gaza airport as a metaphor of the lack of freedom in that sense. Also coming from a country in which the passport was one of the most banned around the world for many, many, many years, and having to ask for a visa everywhere. So I know what does it mean to not be able to move freely. So it's thank you for sharing, you both, all these anecdotes that otherwise never make it to the news and allow to construct the complexity that is needed. I would just ask, are there any other sources that we activists would like to access, to other more practical tools, let's say, that we could engage, like use this opportunity to distribute a little bit of information of what more, of course, opening spaces of conversation, showing, presenting, communicating, giving voice to Palestinians, like you said. Are there any other websites, places that we should be focusing?
I can start from the ones that jump to mind immediately. And these are, for instance, an Israeli organization called Gisha, Maslak in Arabic, that its primary job is to facilitate the passage of Palestinians in and out of Gaza. They sometimes take it to court and sue the Israeli government at the Supreme Court to make sure that Gazans, individuals, not the population, but individual petitioners, can travel in and out if they need medical treatment. They produce regular knowledge on what's happening in Gaza in terms of restrictions. But another thing is, there's an Israeli organization called B'Tselem that employs a large amount of Palestinians that document visually what's happening across the West Bank. There's one called Breaking the Silence that collects unimaginably horrifying testimonies from Israeli soldiers who served in enforcing the occupation or in wars on Gaza. But I think one very touching one would be a group in Gaza that's called We Are Not Numbers, a group of young activists that bring personal stories from the ground. I think it's a team of almost 200 people. Each of them share their stories and stories of their friends. And their main objective is to say that we should not be reduced to statistics that do not generate any sort of sympathy. But one, I can go on with more organization. Human Rights Watch's recent report on apartheid was unprecedented. There is other Palestinian human rights organization, Al-Mizan Center, Al-Haq, Adala, etc. And they are doing an enormously amazing and extraordinary job. But one crucial thing is to produce knowledge as well, either in an artistic expression, visually, or to amplify Palestinian voices. The more knowledge you produce, the more pressure it creates. The only thing that's keeping decision makers engaged in the Palestinian topic is rage and anger, not hope, to be honest. They cannot see any end in the horizon. That's what the US State Secretary Antony Blinken said at his appointment. I don't think it's going to be solved anytime soon. The only thing motivating them is anger and rage. That's the only thing keeping them under pressure to act. But both these issues, they burn very quickly, and they lose motivation very quickly. The more you keep the Palestinian narrative alive, the more you are sure that pressure is continued to solve this and move it forward.
I would like to say something about the human rights organizations. Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course.
So anyway, I just want to say something because I've cooperated with Palestinian Center for Human Rights since I came in 2001. And I must say that Gaza is one of the most well-documented areas, I would think, in the world. And usually during like big conflicts like in 2014, for example, even the 4 Palestinian human rights organizations, they were actually cooperating and working together with Amnesty and working together with Forensic Architecture, documenting, things that has happened. So I think it's really important also that this combination of actually of knowing the facts when you cooperate. Because I remember when I did in 2009, I made this book, Gaza Photo album, which was a cooperation with Palestinian Center for Human Rights. I was working with their fact finders. I decided only to photograph homes of devastated homes after the attack. And with them, I would follow the fact finders and I would have the names of the families and what happened to them. So I think even in the arts, I think like this, I think it's really, really important that it can both be a documentation and with the help of, let's say, photographs, it can move people in a different way than only words. Because I agree with you, Mohammed, that I think after Operation Cast Lead, I don't know if there were 1,400 people who died. And actually, I printed all the names in the book. But still, in the photographs, I didn't show any images of people. I only showed the interiors of bedroom, kitchens, living rooms. And I think in that sense, people could identify with, the subject matter, and it's a different approach. But I really rely on the help and the collaboration with the human rights organizations, which I think is it's good to know because what's going on is really well documented. But we must get people to listen. And if it's a film, as you spoke about, about going through the passages, or if it's, I don't care, but like keeping the information alive and, and getting it out there, I think it's really, really important.
Like one of the most remarkable scenes coming out of Gaza and this escalation was a young boy and a young girl that managed to rescue a fish in its tank. And they stood in front of their destroyed home. And I think there are no words to capture this scene whatsoever. Artistic expressions are way more powerful than, let's say, studies or statistics. Studies are, of course, paramount and essential to give context, to fact check the situation. But art, it has a power that cannot be described in words.
I think that's true, and we talk about this is actually an example of Palestinian pigeons photographed, with the background of the Palestinian passport. It's that kind of color. So I decided to make a series of images of the birds because basically those are the only ones who are, flying, free around. Also as the pigeon being a symbol of peace in a sense. But what I think What I think is important in the work, and we have talked about this before, is that usually when comments are in the big media, it's about the big history. It's about, you know, the structures, about, you know, the rights. But I think that sometimes the small histories, I think, as we said before, people's histories or dreams are really, really important. Because like we say with figures, I think it's important not only to have figures of people being wounded, but also actually to meet these people. And I think that's maybe something which is possible in literature or in art, in film, whatever, which is sometimes forgotten when you have to squeeze in information about a very, very difficult situation on one page, for example.
Yes, precisely. Sometimes you get lost in details in the debate, where, for instance, if you argue that Palestinian actions or Palestinians need to enjoy dignity and freedom, that there are others that are going to jump in and say that you're not getting a clear picture, you need more context, you need more details. But when you bring a story of a highly educated person at the age of 35 that cannot start a life, cannot get a job, cannot leave Gaza, it becomes indisputable. You cannot try to demand more context than that. Exactly. Every human deserves the right to live in dignity, freedom of concern or worry, and freedom of want. And if you capture that as a personal story, it has an immense power to it. If you add a visual image or footage, it gives it more and more power and authority, that it becomes indisputable. If you turn it into art, it becomes extraordinary. It lives on and on forever.
Do you, or do any of you have any other, we've spoken about human rights organizations, but any other recommendations for art from Palestine of the type you speak of?
As I said, the group We Are Not Numbers is one that produces art and personal anecdotes from Gaza. There are artists across Gaza that I can go on and on with their names. One that comes to mind very quickly is called Malak Matar, a very young artist. The painting in the background is one that I managed to get from her and have permanently treasured here. There are others in Gaza. There is a countless number of artists out there that have immense potential: poets, painters, actors, theater players, etc.
There's just a short comment about the writer Atef Abu Saif, who wrote, I think it's called Drones Eating with Me, which is a very, very good, very from a family-based, how it is to live during, you know, like the attacks, on the ongoing attacks. And I can really recommend this book.
Yeah, I think this is a great note to end on. A lot more hopeful than I was expecting. The power of art and of stories and how they can actually change this situation. Do you have any final words?
I can say as a final word that whatever is happening in Gaza, the pain is preventable. That I end on.
Good.
Okay, thank you. There's one question. This stream will be available. If you missed the first part, you can go back and see it later. We will put the links to these websites and information. And I just want to say one more time that this is the last week we have Kent Klich's wonderful exhibition about Gaza International Airport, which you have seen only parts of in low quality in the stream, but you have to get the Havremagasinet to see it for real and to experience this, and to actually help in being a solution for this occupation by learning and by understanding and by seeing stories. of the people of Gaza. So
And
thank you
again-
so much to Kent Klich
Yeah.
and to Muhammad Shehada. Thank you very much for coming here. We are honored to have both of you. And thank you to all of our viewers that have been watching. Yeah. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for hosting us.
Goodbye. Thank you again, Kent Klich.